The desert had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the steady creak of saddle leather. Miles upon miles of arid land stretched ahead, dotted with twisted mesquite, stubborn cacti, and jagged rock formations that seemed to watch like silent sentinels. Upon this lonely road rode a cowboy, a man hardened by years under the sun, yet softened inside by a spirit that refused to let bitterness take root. His name was seldom spoken, for he had no family waiting, no ranch to claim as his own. Folks who crossed his path called him simply the Drifter. His horse, a weathered bay gelding with a scar across one flank, carried him with quiet patience. Dust clung to the animal's coat, and its ribs showed faintly beneath the hide, for food had been scarce. The cowboy leaned forward slightly, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the glare of the afternoon sun. His canteen rattled light, holding barely enough water to wet his throat. He knew he would have to find a spring before nightfall, or both he and his mount would suffer. Despite the hardship, his eyes held a calm resilience. This was not the first time he had been hungry, nor the first time he had ridden through land that seemed intent on testing his endurance. What weighed on him more than the hunger was the silence. The trail stretched endlessly, with no campfires in the distance, no sound of cattle, no voices of men, just him, the horse, and the wide, unforgiving land. As twilight began to fall, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, the cowboy found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here. Once he had worked as a ranch hand, strong and sure with a rope and branding iron, but ranches hired and fired with the seasons, and loyalty counted for little when winter came or cattle markets failed. Too many times he had been told his hands weren't needed anymore. He had learned not to take it personal, but each goodbye carved a little more emptiness inside him. Still, he was not a man who complained. He believed in doing what needed to be done, one step, 1 mile at a time. He carried with him only what he could fit in his saddlebags, a worn Bible that had belonged to his mother, a small hunting knife, and a packet of dried meat and bread. What was left of it? He had rationed carefully, but the last of the bread had gone stale, and the strips of jerky grew thinner each day. Tonight, perhaps, he would finish the last piece. The cowboy guided his horse toward a canyon ahead where the land dipped and shadows stretched deeper. Such places sometimes held water and shelter from the biting desert wind. He could not afford to pass it by. As he rode closer, he felt the air shift, cooler in the shade of the cliffs. The sound of his horse's hooves echoed off the stone walls, breaking the stillness. And then, something stirred. A faint rustle, a soft sound that did not belong to the wind or the horse. The cowboy's hand instinctively drifted toward the revolver at his side, though he kept it low and steady. His eyes scanned the rocks and brush. Out here, one never knew if the movement meant a rattlesnake, a coyote, or something far more dangerous. But what he saw next was none of those. From the shadows of the canyon, a small figure emerged. A child, a girl, no more than 8 or 9 years old. Her steps were weak, her dress torn and dust-stained, her eyes wide with both fear and hunger. She looked at the cowboy as though she had seen a ghost or a miracle. Perhaps both. The cowboy froze in his saddle. He had seen hungry men, desperate men, even dying men. But the sight of a starving child in this wilderness struck him deeper than any bullet ever could. And so began the turn of fate neither he nor the child could have imagined. The cowboy sat frozen in the saddle, his eyes locked on the small figure before him. The girl's thin arms hung limply at her sides, and her face, streaked with dust, seemed far too pale beneath the bronze of her Apache heritage. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak, but lacked the strength to form words. Instead, she lifted one hand slowly and placed it over her stomach. The gesture was small, but it said more than 100 words could. Hunger. The cowboy's heart clenched at the sight. He swung down from the saddle, boots striking the canyon floor with a thud that echoed off the stone walls. His horse snorted and shook its head, but the man kept his gaze fixed on the child. He moved cautiously, lowering himself so he wouldn't tower over her, his voice soft but steady. "Easy now, little one. I mean you no harm." Her dark eyes blinked at him, wary, yet hopeful. She did not back away, nor did she run. That alone told him how desperate she must have been. Children, especially those raised in Apache lands, were taught to fear strangers, most of all white men. Yet here she stood, not because she trusted him, but because the pangs of her hunger outweighed her fear. The cowboy slowly pulled at the flap of his saddlebag. His fingers touched the last of his provisions, a crust of bread, rough and stale, and a thin strip of dried venison. He had been saving it for himself, intending to stretch it another day. His stomach tightened at the thought of parting with it. But when he looked at the girl, her ribs faintly visible beneath the fabric of her torn dress, her hollow cheeks, her trembling hands, his hesitation melted away. He tore the bread in half and held out a piece, along with the jerky. "Here, take it." For a heartbeat, the girl did not move, her eyes flicking from the food to the man's weathered face. Then, with a sudden burst of courage, she darted forward and snatched the offering from his hand. She bit into the bread with such urgency that crumbs scattered across her chin and tears welled in her eyes as though her body could not believe it had found nourishment at last. The cowboy watched silently, his chest heavy with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. He had known hunger in his life, but never the gnawing kind that hollowed a child's eyes. Watching her devour the food stirred something deep within him, a protective instinct, fierce and unshakable. "Slow down, darlin'," he murmured gently, his voice roughened by years of trail dust. "You'll make yourself sick." The girl paused, chewing slower now, though her eyes never left the food as though afraid it might vanish. She clutched the jerky tightly in her small hand, nibbling at it between bites of bread. The cowboy offered her his canteen next. She hesitated, then accepted it, tilting it to her lips. The water was lukewarm, but to her it must have tasted like cool spring rain. She drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, her eyes shining with gratitude. It was then he noticed the way she kept glancing over her shoulder toward the shadows deeper in the canyon, not fearfully, but expectantly, as if someone important, was waiting there. The cowboy narrowed his eyes, scanning the dark crevices of rock. "You out here alone, little miss?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. The girl swallowed the last bite of bread and shook her head faintly. Then she pointed back toward the canyon depths, where the silence grew heavier, as though holding its breath. The cowboy's hand drifted toward his revolver again, not to threaten, but to be ready. For he knew that where there was a child, there was family. And if her kin were Apache, as her features and dress revealed, then he stood on the edge of something far greater than he had reckoned when he rode into this canyon. But at that moment, none of it mattered. Not the risk, not the unknown. What mattered was the child, fed and no longer suffering, if only for the night, and in that small act of kindness, the cowboy's fate began to entwine with hers in ways neither of them yet understood. The girl's eyes never stopped flicking toward the canyon's deeper shadows. Her body, though small and frail, seemed pulled by an unseen tether, as if she longed to run back, yet dared not leave the cowboy's side. He read it clearly. Someone waited for her. Someone she cared for. The cowboy straightened, brushing dust from his coat. His instincts, sharpened by years of drifting through wild country, whispered that this moment was a fragile one. He was a stranger here, a white man alone in Apache lands, a place where misunderstandings often ended in blood. His hand rested, near the butt of his revolver, not out of aggression, but habit. Then he saw her. From the canyon's shadows, a figure stepped forward, tall, proud, and weary all at once. The woman's hair, black as midnight, hung loose around her shoulders, tangled with dust and strands of dry grass. Her face, strong-boned and striking, bore the marks of sleepless nights and hard travel, yet her dark eyes burned with a fire that neither hunger nor despair could dim. She carried herself with dignity, even as her body betrayed exhaustion. The cowboy knew her at once for what she was, the girl's mother. The woman's gaze fell on her daughter first, softening with relief as she saw crumbs of bread clinging to the child's chin. Then her eyes shifted to the cowboy. They narrowed, sharp as flint, and for a long moment, the canyon seemed to hold its breath. The child hurried to her mother, clutching the strip of jerky as if it were treasure. She pressed herself against the woman's side, speaking in quick, excited Apache words. The cowboy didn't understand the tongue, but he didn't need translation. The little one was explaining, showing with her gestures that the stranger had given her food and water. The mother listened, her face unreadable. Slowly she crouched to inspect the girl, brushing crumbs from her cheek, touching her hair as if to confirm she was real and safe. When she looked up again, her eyes fixed on the cowboy with an intensity that rooted him where he stood. He lifted his hands slightly, palms open. She was hungry, he said quietly, his voice steady, though he knew she might not understand the words. I gave her what I had. For a long while, the woman said nothing. Her stare measured him, not just his words, but his stance, his tone, his every movement. This was not the first time she had faced a man from beyond her people's world, and she carried the caution of one who had learned not to trust lightly. At last, she spoke. Her voice was low and melodic, yet edged with authority. The cowboy caught only fragments of meaning, but the weight of her tone was unmistakable. She was questioning him, perhaps challenging his intent. The child tugged at her mother's sleeve, pointing to the cowboy's saddlebags, then miming the act of eating. Her mother's gaze softened again. She turned back to him, and with slow, deliberate steps, she approached. The cowboy felt his throat tighten. He had faced gunfighters, rustlers, even hostile raids, but there was something about this woman's calm, unyielding presence that unsettled him more than danger ever had. She stopped only a few feet away, her eyes never leaving his. Then, to his surprise, she bowed her head, just slightly, but enough to signal something far greater than courtesy. When she lifted her gaze again, her voice carried words in broken English, halting yet clear. You fed my daughter. It was not a question. It was a statement, heavy with meaning. The cowboy nodded once. The woman's lips pressed together as if holding back emotion. She placed her hand gently on her daughter's head, then pressed that same hand to her own chest. Finally, she pointed at him. Her next words came with solemn weight, as though carved from the bedrock of time itself. By our ancestors. By our law. I am yours. The canyon seemed to still, as though the very earth paused to hear the vow. The cowboy stood rooted, stunned by words he could hardly comprehend, yet instinctively knew carried a bond stronger than steel. He had fed a child, but in doing so, he had awakened a tradition older than his own world, one that now bound his fate to the woman standing before him. The words lingered in the canyon air like a ghost that refused to fade. By our ancestors, by our law, I am yours? The cowboy stared at the Apache woman, not quite believing what he'd heard. He had known customs among different tribes, ceremonies, vows, codes of honor, but nothing like this. Surely she couldn't mean what it sounded like. A man feeds a hungry child, and suddenly a woman pledges herself to him? No, there had to be more to it. The woman stood straight now, shoulders squared as if summoning the last of her strength. Her hand rested on her daughter's head protectively, but her eyes never wavered from his. The canyon wind tugged strands of her dark hair across her face, yet she didn't brush them aside. She looked carved from the same stone that loomed around them, unyielding, resolute. The cowboy shifted uneasily, drawing in a breath. "Ma'am, I don't reckon you owe me anything. I gave your little one some food, is all." His words, though soft, sounded clumsy against the weight of her declaration. She tilted her head as though searching for meaning. Then she spoke again, slower this time, her English rough but deliberate. "In my people, a child hungry is shame and curse. The man who gives food, he give life." She touched her daughter's thin shoulder. "Life of my blood." Her hand then pressed to her chest. "So, my life belonged to him." The cowboy felt his pulse quicken. She wasn't speaking in riddles. She meant it, every word. He ran a hand over his jaw, dust scratching beneath his fingers. "Lady, where I come from, folks help each other when they can. It don't mean what you're saying." The woman's dark eyes flared. She raised her chin with quiet pride. "You do not understand. Law of ancestors, older than your people's roads, older than Iron Horse." Her gaze was steady as the desert stars. "If man save child with food, mother's life tie to him, forever, forever." The words settled like a weight across his shoulders. He thought of the long, lonely miles he'd ridden, the fleeting jobs, the goodbyes that always came too soon. He had never belonged anywhere, never bound himself to anyone. And now, here in this hidden canyon, a woman he barely knew was offering him something permanent, by a law she held sacred. His throat worked, but no words came. He looked at the child, who now clung to her mother's side, chewing slowly at the last strip of jerky. Her eyes were brighter now, her face less hollow. He had given her nothing more than what he could spare, yet to them, it was salvation. The cowboy knelt down, his hat brushing dust as he lowered himself to the girl's level. He spoke quietly, more to himself than to her. "Didn't think a crust of bread could change the world." The mother stepped closer, her shadow falling over both of them. She placed her hand on his shoulder, not as a gesture of possession, but as one of solemn recognition. "Not bread," she said firmly. "You give hope. Without hope, spirit die. By ancestors' law, hope is life." Her words struck him deeper than any sermon or frontier preacher ever had. For a man who had wandered too long without purpose, they carried a truth he could not deny. And yet, he couldn't help but wonder what came next. He rose slowly, brushing dust from his coat. "If I take this vow of yours, if I don't walk away, what does it mean? What does it make us?" The woman's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something steadier, a promise etched in silence. She touched her daughter's cheek, then met his eyes. "It make us family." The canyon seemed to echo with her words, as though even the stones bore witness. And in that moment, the cowboy realized his solitary ride had ended, not by choice, but by fate, written long before he ever set foot in Apache land. The cowboy stood in silence, the weight of her words heavy in his chest. "It make us family. Family." It was a word he had not heard directed at himself in years. He'd left his kin behind long ago, some by death, some by drifting apart. Out here on the frontier, a man survived on his own grit, and if he was lucky, a horse beneath him. Family was something he watched from a distance. Other men's wives waiting at the porch, children running barefoot through the dust, laughter spilling from homes he would never enter. Now, in a canyon carved by centuries of wind and stone, a woman he had just met was binding him to her life, to her child, by a law he didn't understand. He cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't come easy. "Ma'am, where I'm from, things don't work like this. A man don't claim a woman just 'cause he handed her kin a meal." The Apache mother's eyes hardened, though not with anger. Her pride was too strong for anger. Instead, her gaze held a patient defiance, as if she'd heard such doubts before. "This not your way," she said simply, "but it is ours. Blood law, old law. If you break it, you break spirit of ancestors. You break her spirit." She touched her daughter's small hand. "And mine." Her voice dropped, a thread of steel woven through the melody. "I will not live shamed." The cowboy shifted his hat back on his head, unease rising like dust after a storm. He respected honor. He lived by it, in his own way. But he had never been bound to a code outside his own. He wanted to protest, to tell her he hadn't meant for this, that his kindness was just instinct, not a claim. But the words caught, in his throat. The little girl was watching him. Her eyes, wide and solemn, carried none of the suspicion her mother bore, only hope. He realized that to her, this wasn't about law or pride. It was about safety, stability. A man who fed her might also protect her. Children didn't measure the world in laws. They measured it in who gave them comfort when they cried and food when they were hungry. He felt the canyon walls close in on him, pressing his two worlds together. In his world, men roamed free, answering to no one but themselves. In hers, bonds were sacred, sealed not with contracts or rings, but with acts that touched the spirit. The cowboy rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low and uneasy. "Suppose I ride on. Suppose I leave you here and we forget this talk. What then?" The woman's face darkened like a storm brewing over the desert. "Then you leave us cursed. My people, they know law. If I say it, it is truth. If you ride away, you leave me without honor, without place. My daughter without name, she will be ghost in her own blood." Her words cut sharp. Ghost in her own blood. He couldn't shake them. The cowboy turned away, staring down the canyon path he had come from. His horse pawed at the earth impatiently, as if sensing his turmoil. A man like him could always ride on. There were endless trails, endless horizons. But for the woman and her daughter, there was no riding on. There was only the law, and the bond his bread and water had forged. He clenched his fists at his sides. Everything in him wanted to resist, to fight against a tie he had never asked for. Yet a quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered that maybe, just maybe, he had been drifting too long. That fate, or the ancestors she spoke of, had led him here for a reason. The woman stepped closer, her daughter hidden safely behind her skirts. Her voice softened, though it carried no less strength. "You have choice, cowboy. Not in law, but in heart. You can take bond as curse, or as gift." The canyon wind stilled. The cowboy felt the chasm between his world and hers, two ways of living, two truths colliding. And in that moment he realized this was no simple matter of bread or tradition. It was a reckoning. The canyon was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that comforted a man. It was the brittle stillness of a rattler coiled in the brush, waiting, watching, ready to strike. The cowboy felt it first in his gut, a tightening that came from years of knowing when something was off. He glanced at the woman, who seemed to sense it too. Her eyes swept the canyon rim above them, her posture sharpening like a drawn bowstring. Even the little girl went still, clutching her mother's skirt, as if some instinct told her that laughter and movement no longer belonged here. The cowboy slid his hand across his belt, fingers brushing the worn grip of his revolver. He spoke low, his voice steady but edged. "We ain't alone." The woman gave a single nod. She whispered something swift in Apache to her daughter, who darted behind a boulder and crouched low, her small form nearly vanishing in the shadows. The cowboy admired how quickly the child obeyed. It spoke of discipline, of a life where danger was never far. The sound came next, a faint clatter of stone on stone. Someone had moved along the canyon wall above them. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Raiders, maybe. Outlaws. Or worse, men who preyed on the vulnerable, knowing that the law of the territory reached poorly into places like this. The woman crouched slightly, her hand gripping a knife that had been hidden in the folds of her dress. The blade was short, but the way she held it told the cowboy she knew how to use it. She caught his eye, and for the first time, he saw something like trust flicker there. Not trust in who he was, but in what he might do when the fight came. Then, they appeared. 3 men stepped out from the rocks above, their outlines jagged against the fading sky. Rough figures, dust-caked hats pulled low, rifles slung across their shoulders. They grinned down into the canyon like wolves who had cornered their prey. "Well now," one of them drawled, his voice echoing. "Looks like we stumbled on a fine little gathering, white drifter, and an Apache woman, with a kid too." His grin widened. "Ain't this our lucky day?" The cowboy felt his blood go cold. He had seen men like this before, scavengers who thrived on the weak, who measured life in bullets and spoils. He knew what they wanted, the food on his horse, the coins in his pocket, and likely the woman. He raised his voice, calm but firm. "Ain't no luck here for you. Turn back." The men laughed, the sound cruel and sharp. One leaned on his rifle. "Easy now, cowboy. Ain't no call to get jumpy. Just hand over what you got, and maybe we let you ride out of here." His eyes slid to the woman, lingering in a way that made the cowboy's jaw clench. "Her, though, reckon she comes with us." The woman stiffened, her knife flashing as she shifted her stance. The little girl whimpered softly from behind the rock, the sound barely audible. The cowboy's hand tightened on his revolver. He had been outnumbered before, had stared down barrels and bluffed his way free. But this was different. This wasn't just his hide on the line. He stepped forward, planting himself between the woman and the raiders above. His voice was iron now. "She ain't yours. Neither is the kid. You want to fight? You'll have it with me." A beat of silence followed, the canyon holding its breath once more. Then the leader spat into the dust. "So be it." Rifles lifted. The cowboy drew. The crack of gunfire split the twilight, echoing through the canyon walls. The fight for survival had begun. The first shot tore through the canyon, a sharp thunderclap that sent the little girl ducking lower behind her stone shelter. Dust kicked up near the cowboy's boots, a warning shot meant to rattle him. But he was no greenhorn. His hand was already steady on the revolver, eyes narrowed, body crouched low as he drew a bead on the silhouettes above. He fired once, clean and quick. One of the raiders jerked back with a howl, clutching his shoulder as his rifle clattered against the rocks. The canyon walls spat the echo back like a chorus of ghosts. The woman beside him didn't hesitate. With a sharp cry, she hurled her knife. The blade spun end over end, catching the moonlight before sinking into the thigh of another raider. He cursed and stumbled, nearly losing his footing on the ledge. The cowboy spared her a glance. Sharp admiration flickered in his eyes. She wasn't just proud, she was fierce. But the men weren't beaten yet. The leader, teeth bared in a wolfish grin, leveled his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the stone just inches from the cowboy's head, showering him with shards. He ducked, cursing under his breath, and rolled toward a boulder for cover. "Stay low!" he barked to the woman, though she needed no telling. She had already scooped up a fist-sized rock, hurling it with uncanny aim toward the raider's perch. It struck the wounded man's hand, sending his rifle tumbling down into the canyon floor. The child, wide-eyed but brave, scrambled from her hiding place to snatch it up before he could reclaim it. She dragged it behind the boulder, her tiny arms trembling under its weight. The cowboy's heart kicked hard in his chest. Tough little thing, he thought grimly. Keep her down, he called to the woman. The leader cursed from above. You think you can play hero, cowboy? You're outgunned and outnumbered. The cowboy spat into the dust, eyes cold. I've been outnumbered since the day I was born. He rose just long enough to fire again. 2 shots in quick succession. One went wide, sparking off rock, but the other grazed the leader's hat, clean off his head. The man roared in fury, firing back wildly. The Apache woman darted forward, reclaiming her knife from the fallen raider's leg with a swift, brutal twist. The man screamed, clutching the wound, but she was already retreating. Back to cover. Her face was calm, her movements precise. She was fighting not just for herself, but for her daughter, and it showed in every step. The cowboy knew they couldn't hold here forever. The raiders had the high ground. But fear wasn't in him, not tonight. He waited, steady as stone, until he heard the scrape of boots above, signaling one of the men shifting for a better shot. That was his opening. He drew in a slow breath, popped up from cover, and squeezed the trigger. His bullet found its mark, and the second raider dropped, rifle clattering down beside him. That left only the leader. The man snarled like a cornered beast. He fired again, the shot ripping through the woman's sleeve. She gasped, stumbling back, but there was no blood, only torn cloth. The cowboy's heart lurched, but relief followed when he saw she was unhurt. Enough! The leader roared, rage twisting his face. He started down the slope, rifle raised like a club, intent on finishing it by hand. The cowboy stepped out from cover, revolver aimed dead center. His voice rang clear, steady as steel. You take one more step and you won't take another. The raider hesitated, eyes flicking between the cowboy's unyielding stance and the Apache woman at his side, her knife gleaming again in the firelight. For the first time, doubt cracked his bravado. He spat into the dirt, backing up slowly. This ain't over, he growled. Then, with a bitter snarl, he scrambled up and vanished over the canyon rim. The echoes of gunfire faded. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged breaths of the survivors. The cowboy lowered his revolver, holstering it with a heavy sigh. His gaze turned to the woman and her daughter. They were safe. For now. And in that moment, he knew the fight had bound them together tighter than any law ever could. The canyon was still, its silence heavy after the storm of gunfire. Smoke from spent cartridges lingered in the air, curling like thin ghosts toward the stars. The cowboy stood with his revolver at his side, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, his eyes fixed on the rim where the last raider had disappeared. His ears strained for any sign of return, but the night offered none. Only the soft cry of a night bird and the faint rustle of wind against stone. He turned at last. The Apache woman was kneeling, gathering her daughter into her arms. The child clutched the heavy rifle she had dragged to safety, her tiny frame trembling now that the danger had passed. Her tears spilled silently, soaking into her mother's dress. The woman rocked her gently, whispering low words in her native tongue, soothing, strong, a lullaby of courage disguised as comfort. The cowboy approached slowly, not wanting to break the fragile peace. He touched the brim of his hat, his voice quiet. She's safe now. You both are. The woman lifted her gaze to him. For the first time, her dark eyes carried not just caution, but something else, something deep, unshaken, and reverent. She rose, her daughter still clinging to her hip, and walked toward him with measured steps. When she stopped, she set the child down gently, then straightened to her full height. The canyon moonlight bathed her face, sharpening her strong features, softening her weary beauty. She looked at him as though seeing him not as a drifter, not as a stranger, but as something fated. "You fought for us," she said, her English, halting but strong. "Not for food, not for law, for us." The cowboy shifted, uncomfortable under her steady gaze. "Didn't figure to do otherwise," he muttered. "Would have done the same for any woman, any child." Her head shook, slowly, firmly. "No. Many men see but walk away. You stayed. You stood between death and my blood." She placed her hand over her heart, her voice trembling with a rare vulnerability. "You fed her. You saved her. Twice. That is more than law. That is life." The high cowboy swallowed hard. Her words carried the weight of something larger than gratitude. She wasn't speaking of debt. She was speaking of devotion. She stepped closer, closing the space between them until only a breath lingered. Her eyes, glistening with moonlight, locked onto his. Then she lowered herself onto one knee, bowing her head, not in defeat, but in reverence. Her daughter, watching wide-eyed, mimicked her, placing both small hands over her chest. The cowboy stiffened. "Now hold on. Ain't no need for kneeling. I'm no king. Just a man with a gun and a horse." The woman's voice rang soft but unshakable. "No, you are man who saved us. By ancestors, I was yours when you fed her. But now—" She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze from where she knelt. "Now I give myself by choice, not as bond, but as vow." Her words struck him harder than bullets. In his world, promises were cheap, easily broken, but in hers, vows were blood and breath, sacred as the earth itself. She was offering not servitude, not debt, but something far more binding: loyalty. The cowboy's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her he wasn't the kind of man to keep people, that he lived, with no ties, no roots. But as he looked at the woman, proud even in weariness, and the child clinging to her skirts with eyes full of trust, the words died in his mouth. Instead, he tipped his hat low, voice rough. "You don't owe me, ma'am, but I reckon I'm honored." The woman rose slowly, dignity intact. Her vow had been spoken, sealed not by tradition alone, but by her will. And in that moment, the cowboy realized this bond was no longer about ancestral law. It was about choice, courage, and something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. The fire burned low in the canyon hollow, its glow painting the stone walls in flickers of red and gold. The cowboy sat with his back against a boulder, hat tilted forward, though he wasn't sleeping. His revolver rested across his lap, his hand draped over it in habit. The woman and her daughter huddled beneath a blanket near the fire, their figures outlined against the dancing light. The child slept soundly now, her breathing soft and steady, a miracle after the fear and hunger of the day. But the cowboy's mind wasn't quiet. Her words echoed through him like a church bell tolling in the still of night. "Now I give myself by choice, not as bond, but as vow." He shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't a man accustomed to vows, not anymore. Once, maybe, long ago, he'd dreamed of building a life somewhere, a patch of land, a wife, children running barefoot in the yard. But life on the frontier had a way of grinding down such dreams. They had been replaced with hard miles, fleeting pay, and the lonely silence of the trail. He glanced toward the fire again. The woman sat upright despite her fatigue, watching him from across the flames. Her eyes did not waver when he caught her gaze. There was no coyness in her, no game of courtship, only steadiness, as if she had already decided and was waiting for him to do the same. The cowboy let out a long breath. "You sure about this?" he asked softly, his voice carrying across the crackling fire. The woman tilted her head. "I am sure. My law made it so. But my heart, it made it stronger. Her words struck him deep, though he tried to hide it, with a wry chuckle. Stronger, huh? You don't even know my name. Her lips curved faintly, the shadow of a smile. Name does not matter. Spirit does. I saw it in fight. I saw it in bread you gave her. That is enough. The cowboy swallowed, staring into the fire as the wood popped and shifted. Spirit. That was something he hadn't thought about in years. Men judged him by his aim with a gun, his skill with cattle, his grit on the trail. But not his spirit. He had almost forgotten he had one. Still, doubt pressed at him. If I take you with me, you'll be branded by my world. Folks'll talk. Apache woman with a white drifter. They'll call you names. They'll look at the little one with suspicion. You'll both pay for being tied to me. The woman's gaze sharpened, fierce and unbending. We already pay. With hunger, with fear, with no man to guard us. I choose this. I choose you. Better to face the world with one true protector than die with none. Her words silenced him. The crackle of the fire filled the canyon again, mingling with the distant call of a coyote. The cowboy finally looked up, meeting her eyes across the flames. In them, he saw no illusion, no fragile dream. He saw a woman hardened by survival yet unbroken. A mother whose love for her child outweighed every danger. She had chosen him, not out of desperation, but out of conviction. And for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of something he thought long buried. Purpose. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his voice rough but steady. All right then. If you're willing to walk this trail with me, I won't turn you away. You and the girl, you ride with me now. We'll face whatever comes together. The woman's eyes softened, relief breaking through her stoicism. She reached across the fire, placing her hand gently on her daughter's head, then lifting it to press over her own heart. You choose us, she said simply. The cowboy gave a single nod. I do. The fire crackled between them, sealing the choice like a witness. And though the trail ahead was uncertain, for the first time in a long while, the cowboy felt he was no longer riding it alone. The dawn broke over the canyon in a wash of pink and gold, spilling across the jagged cliffs and chasing away the shadows of the night. The fire had burned to ash, sending up the faintest thread of smoke, and the air was cool with the promise of day. The cowboy was already awake, saddling his horse with slow, deliberate motions. He paused once, lifting his gaze to the horizon, as though weighing the miles that lay ahead. He had traveled that horizon alone for so long that he had forgotten what it might feel like to share it. Behind him, the soft murmur of voices stirred. The Apache woman knelt beside her daughter, braiding the child's long, dark hair with careful fingers. The girl giggled softly, tugging at the hem of her mother's dress when she tickled too much. The sound, so pure, so alive, struck the cowboy in a place he thought long dead. He cinched the saddle tight and walked back toward them. Mornin', he said gruffly, tipping his hat. The woman lifted her gaze, a faint smile touching her lips. Mornin'. The little girl grinned up at him, unafraid now, and held up a small wildflower she had plucked from the canyon floor. Its petals were pale yellow, trembling in the breeze. She pressed it into his calloused hand without a word. The cowboy swallowed, hard, tucking the fragile bloom into his vest pocket as if it were worth more than gold. Much obliged, darlin'. They broke camp together. The woman moved with quiet efficiency, gathering their few belongings, while the child busied herself with chasing shadows across the sand. For the first time, the cowboy did not feel the restless urge to ride on fast and far. Instead, he felt something steadier, a pull to linger, to build, to protect. When the horses were ready, he extended his hand. The woman hesitated only a moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, strong, unyielding. He helped her mount, then lifted the child into her mother's lap. The three of them now sat astride the trail, ready to face whatever the frontier had, waiting. As they rode out of the canyon, the cowboy spoke over his shoulder. "There's a ranch not far from here. Land's tough but good. Been needing strong hands to work it. Maybe it's time I put mine to use there. Might be a place you two could call home." The woman tilted her head, studying him with those unflinching eyes. "A place?" she repeated softly. He nodded. "Not just a place. A life. One worth holding on to." She considered his words, then glanced down at her daughter, who had already nestled against her, eyelids drooping in the morning sun. A warmth spread across her face, quiet but certain. "Then we will ride there. Together." The cowboy's chest tightened at her answer. For years, he had been nothing more than a drifting shadow, chasing cattle, gold, and the next horizon. But now he carried something worth more than all of it. A vow, a bond, a family born not of blood, but of choice. The trails stretched wide before them, endless and uncertain. They would face hardship, no doubt. Prejudice, hunger, maybe even more raiders who would not forget their defeat. But the cowboy no longer feared the road ahead. With the woman's steady spirit and the child's laughter beside him, he felt anchored in a way he had not in years. As the sun climbed higher, casting their long shadows on the open earth, the cowboy reached into his vest and touched the small yellow flower, fragile yet enduring. It was a reminder. Life could bloom, even in the harshest soil. He straightened in the saddle, voice carrying over the open land. "All right then, let's ride." And with that, the cowboy, the Apache mother, and her daughter set out together, toward a life neither of them had expected, but all of them had chosen, a new beginning carved from law, from choice, and from the fire of survival.